How to get the youth involved in solving the problems rather than only describing the problems was an important motivation. Air pollution is a major problem, again, across the developing world, including in my country, in India. For your viewers and listeners, they have to understand that the way we are tackling climate change globally is on the basis of a framework convention under the United Nations called the UNFCCC. But promises are only as good as they are delivered. No one likes a broken promise. So for the global south, what is the promise? It's a deal that I will promise to build clean energy infrastructure, or I'll promise to have more sustainable industries. In return, we would like to see the investment. We would like to see the technologies. One is public finance, one is private finance. Public finance is you and I will get taxed, and that'll go into the government kitty, and the government will have to decide, do I spend it on climate change, or do I spend it on education, or do I spend it on health?
There are so many young people who do care about the world, but they don't know where to start from. What is the best piece of advice that you'd like to give for them?
Dream big. That's the best piece of advice I can give. Technology and finance and investment were headed towards a particular direction of the green economy, about the energy transition. Now, how could we in the developing world tap into those opportunities and not get left behind?
Hey everyone, welcome back to a special podcast. So as you all do know that Hari Global Network is one of the largest media networks in Sri Lanka with nearly 3 million subscribers across our social media platforms. Not only that, what makes us special is that we create contents which are of public interest, whether it is of international or local perspectives. So for today's interview, we've got the pleasure in having Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, and he's an author, advisor, and the powerhouse behind the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, it's a real pleasure in having you for our special podcast. So, Doctor, when going through your profile, there was much of work services which were rendered from you where I didn't know from where to start from. But let me take it back to here. What inspired you to become the founder of CEEW?
Thank you, Disaka, for having me on your show. Great to be here on the Hari TV platform. I founded CEEW in 2010, soon after the Copenhagen climate meetings. And the idea was to build an independent institution headquartered in India but representing the global south. I felt that there were three things missing. First, we needed the capacity within the developing countries to analyze what was happening with climate change. It was, of course, a global problem, but uniquely experienced by us in developing countries that also had to grow their economies, lift people out of poverty, get people access to energy, but do it in a sustainable way. This was something that the advanced economies of the world had already done, but done in a sequential fashion. We had to do all of this simultaneously. That means we had to come up with the solutions. The second reason was that technology and finance and investment were headed towards a particular direction of the green economy, about the energy transition. Now, how could we in the developing world tap into those opportunities and not get left behind? That was a second motivation. And a third motivation was, how do we get young people to be invested in this crisis, but also the opportunity that is presented. My country, India, is one of the youngest in the world. We've got more than 60% of the population under the age of 25. So even at CEW now, with a staff of over 380 people, our median age throughout these 15 years has remained under 30. Because when you bring young energy to complex problems, we can work at the cutting edge. So how to get the youth involved in solving the problems rather than only describing the problems was an important motivation.
Absolutely. So you've worked with over nearly 50 countries, right? And what has the global thought about this climate leadership?
Well, climate change is a problem that we are all facing, but some of us are impacted more than others. If you take our region alone, South Asia, we're one of the most vulnerable. India is a country of 1.4 billion people. Sri Lanka is a much smaller country, 22 million people. But we are among the most vulnerable countries. Now, what does vulnerability mean? Vulnerability means that the past is no longer a predictor of the future. So when you think about weather patterns, when you think about disasters, when you think about agriculture and agricultural yields, when you think about the kind of infrastructure that you have to build out, all of this, the lessons from the past are relevant but not sufficient. So we have to start understanding that what was an extreme circumstance in the past is now becoming normal. What is extreme today will become normal tomorrow. That means we have to build in resilience in our systems. That's priority number one. The second thing is that the energy transition, meaning the shift from fossil energy to clean energy sources, is also an opportunity for what I call an economic transformation. How do you use clean energy to drive a different kind of economic structure, new types of industries, many millions more jobs? That is an exciting proposition. So climate change is occurring across the world, but for us in the developing world, we're feeling it differently. It's our different lived reality, and therefore our approach towards it in building resilience and building a greener economy is really where the priorities should lie.
I also saw your TED Talk, which was on Mission 80-80-80, and I really enjoyed it, by the way. Could you just give our audience a brief outline about it?
Well, air pollution is a major problem, again, across the developing world, including in my country, in India. And air pollution is now one of the largest, if not the largest, public health crises resulting from environmental challenges. It means loss of millions of lives globally, but it is also an economic cost. It is lowering your economic output, whether in agriculture, it is lowering your productivity of the labor force. So when I talked about Mission 80-80-80 for my TED Talk, I was trying to put forward a vision that by 2027, when India becomes an 80-year-old independent nation, could we reduce air pollution by 80% in 80 cities? That was the vision.
Now, you've also been super involved with the Global Climate Service in terms of COP summits and G20, even just recently appointed as the Brazil's special envoy for COP 30. What has the journey been like?
It's been a combination of reality checks, frustration, but also optimism and hope. I've been involved with global climate discussions for well over a decade. And if for your viewers and listeners, they have to understand that the way we are tackling climate change globally is on the basis of a framework convention under the United Nations called the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was signed in 1992. Over the last 3 decades or so, countries have made some progress, but not sufficient progress, and the climate is warming faster than we had predicted. But over the last decade, when the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and subsequently several other developments, countries have come forward with their own plans. Sri Lanka has its plan called the Nationally Determined Contribution. India has its own nationally determined contribution. And that's where it gets exciting. When you create your plans bottom up, rather than impose a solution top down, you begin to see that you can craft a plan that makes sense for you. So Sri Lanka wants to get 70% of its energy from renewable energy sources, including hydropower. India promised to have 50% of its entire electricity grid, which is the 3rd largest in the world, to come from non-fossil sources. It's already at over 49%. These are bottom-up approaches, and that's what gives me hope and optimism, because you can then focus on your domestic solutions and then scale it up. In that scaling up, one of the opportunities that I've been very excited by, and I was involved in its conceptualization, design in its early days, is the International Solar Alliance. And Sri Lanka is a member. In fact, the regional committee meetings are happening here in Colombo as we speak. It now has well over 120 member countries. So how do the countries in the developing world, between the tropics, where the sun shines the most, aggregate their demand, lower down the costs, offer longer-term policy direction, and crowd in the billions of dollars of investment that we need in our economies to drive a new type of energy infrastructure? So yes, we've not solved the climate crisis. We've gone slow. There are challenges with the negotiations. But equally, if we focused on our bottom-up solutions and we focused on forms of cooperation that work, that are practical, then there's hope. And as this year's special envoy for COP30, that is to be held in Brazil, I'm trying to represent the interests of South Asia. You see, we are vulnerable, but we are also action-oriented.
So these topics are not much talked in the social media platforms, if I'm right. So Hari TV, the Hari Global Network, being one of the largest global networks in Sri Lanka with nearly 3 million subscribers across the social media platforms, what we focus is to bring the true facts about what happens in local wise and also as in the perspective of internationally. Back into the questions, Doctor. So what should the Global South prioritize be in COP30?
The first priority has to be implementation. We come to these climate negotiations called COPs and often just keep making promises. But promises are only as good as they are delivered. No one likes a broken promise. So for the Global South, what is the promise? It's a deal that I will promise to build clean energy infrastructure, or I'll promise to have more sustainable industries. In return, we would like to see the investment. We would like to see the technologies being deployed. We would like to co-develop those technologies so that we're not just sitting around waiting for someone to hand it out to us. Now, in implementing these deals, we need to solve for the challenges of finance and the challenges of technology and the challenges of capacity. Finance is costly, and in developing countries, it's costlier than in developed countries. So how do we lower the cost of finance so that you can take on your debt at lower cost and deploy the clean energy infrastructure? The second thing is that we have to design technological solutions that work for us. If you take an island country like Sri Lanka, with maybe limited land area, the solutions that will work in terms of decentralized energy systems might not be the same as where you have a large country with a lot of land mass where you can build large-scale infrastructure. So you have to design those technologies and those business models that are locally relevant. And third priority is that this has to be part of the overall economic development strategy. Because if the energy transition does not create new jobs, does not help build new industries, then the public will not support it in any country. So I think as we approach the climate negotiations, you've got to start thinking beyond just the asks and the needs to thinking about how do you implement with these innovative financial solutions, with these innovative, locally relevant technological solutions, and making sure that you're delivering on jobs and growth.
When taking countries like Sri Lanka, which comes under Global South countries, they're facing for extreme climate changes. So what does the country do need to build resilience and adaptations? How can they build resilience and adaptations?
You know, Sri Lanka alone, between 1990 and 2018, suffered about $7 billion of direct economic damages because of climate extremes. There's about just flood-related calamities amounted to about $2 billion. And this will only get worse as the climate changes further. By 2060, there could be up to 2 degrees of warming here in Sri Lanka. Sea level rise, which is particularly problematic for island countries, could be 20 to 58 centimeters. Even extreme heat, what is on average, say, 20 days in the entire year of 35 degrees plus of temperatures, could rise to 100 days of 35 degrees plus temperatures by the end of this century. So what do we do? The first thing we have to do is map these risks in a hyper-local way. And hyper-local meaning that within our countries, within our provinces, within the districts, within the towns and the cities, within them inside neighborhoods, we need to start collecting data that is granular, because granular information helps you to act in a very precise way. Let's say you're having body ache. You say, I'm having body ache. Now, I wouldn't know how to treat you. But if you say, oh, my arm is aching, or this part of my arm is aching, then you know how to intervene, right? It's the same when it comes to building resilience. So hyperlocal data is critical. We at CEW are developing the first high-resolution climate resilience atlas for India. The second thing that needs to happen is you've got to make sure your infrastructure is modular to be able to withstand climate shocks, which means if you're building roads, highways, bridges, you should be able to prepare for what kind of climate shocks will hit you 10 years on, 20 years on, and make sure that at that time, if it's washed away, your investment is washed away. So designing infrastructure that is responsive to future climate shocks. And third thing, very critically, is you've got to bring in insurance. Today, if a smallholder farmer loses their crops because there's a drought or there is a flood, what do you do? The governments in developing countries are going to run out of cash to kind of hand out compensation. So we need to design insurance mechanisms so that when you're faced with a shock, it could be a health shock, it could be an agriculture shock, it could be an infrastructure shock, you get a payout. None of this is easy, but this requires dedicated attention, knowing that the climate is changing, how we build our resilience to bounce back better.
Great. So, what efforts had India taken to overcome and adapt accordingly? And from those efforts that India had taken, what can Sri Lanka adopt from it?
Well, on the adaptation and resilience side, it's important to recognize that India has been focusing quite a lot on mapping out those extreme disasters and creating early warning systems. In 1999, for instance, we had a super cyclone, which in the east of the country cost about just short of 10,000 lives. 20 years later, a similar sized cyclone in the same region cost less than 70 lives. So the intensity of the cyclone is the same. The response was early warning systems, right, that protected people and gave them advance warning. We have to do that now with flood early warning, heat warnings, etc. So you're protecting lives and livelihoods. That's number one. The second thing is that we've got to start investing in new types of infrastructure or crop choices and agriculture, which is more climate resilient. So what kind of crops can grow even when there is a drought, when there's a water stress, etc. So India is experimenting with things like that. The third is the energy transition. When I set up my institution in 2010, India had less than 20 megawatts of solar. It now has over 100,000 megawatts of solar. It has become the world's fourth largest renewable energy country by deployed capacity. And that has come on the back of transparent markets, market competition that has constantly driven down prices so that consumers pay less and less, to the extent that now renewables plus battery storage is turning out to be cheaper than fossil fuels. So if we as economies shared our learnings on how to provide early warnings to save lives and livelihoods, how to invest in new types of infrastructure and crops, etc., that are climate resilient, and drive the energy transition in a sustainable, financially sustainable way, then there's a huge opportunity to scale up these investments. And then there is also the opportunity to cooperate with each other through sharing of energy, undersea cables, etc. The surplus power in India can be sent to Sri Lanka or vice versa, and so forth. So we have to start reimagining our modes of cooperation in a way that brings us closer together as countries and economies.
Great. So all these adaptation efforts do require finance. So how can the Global South mobilize the finance?
There are two components here. One is public finance, one is private finance. Public finance is you and I will get taxed, and that'll go into the government kitty, and the government will have to decide, do I spend it on climate change, or do I spend it on education, or do I spend it on health? So public finance will always be limited. So there is supposed to be international public finance as well, climate finance, which has been negotiated. Until recently, it used to be $100 billion. Then last year at the climate negotiations, it was up to $300 billion. But developing countries have not yet seen all of that money come through, at least certainly not on time. The real source of finance is going to be private finance. That could be domestic. It could be from international sources. The question is, how do you crowd it in? How do you attract that capital? And to do that, we in developing countries need to set clear targets, have robust policies, make sure we don't change our policies regularly, because if you and I were investing and the laws and the policies kept changing, we wouldn't invest because there's a risk to our savings that we're investing there. So have clear direction of policy and make sure that it sticks, and use the limited amount of public finance to reduce the risks of private investment. That way you can crowd in 10 times, 15 times, 20 times more private capital. That is really how India has been trying to do it, and other developing countries will also have to do the same. Because ultimately, look, nearly 90% of all new electricity demand over the next 2 decades will come from developing countries. So that infrastructure has to be built out for our homes, for our factories, for our farms, for our shopping malls. Now, if that electricity infrastructure has to be clean, we've got to make sure that every new additional rupee and dollar that's coming in is going towards cleaner and cleaner sources. And we've got to make sure that that is de-risked in a way that investors are comfortable in investing in our countries.
Great. So now moving to water scarcity. Water scarcity is one of the major growing issue where, according to my search, I found that nearly 2.2 billion people are right now suffering, and beyond that too. So when talking about water scarcity, how can a country overcome water scarcity, and how is preservative? How does preservative play an important role when talking about these scarcities?
Well, the challenge with water is that sometimes there's too much, and sometimes there's too little, and sometimes it's in the wrong place, and sometimes it's too polluted. So I think of water as our weakest link when it comes to the climate crisis.
Why?
Because without water of sufficient quantity, at the right time, and in the right location, your economic systems, your public health systems can all get severely impacted. So like the famous rhyme of the ancient mariner, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So there's no point in having too much water when you're about to harvest your crop. And there's no point having too little water when you've just sowed your seeds. So we at CEW, we did an analysis of precipitation in patterns in the 4,500 odd sub-districts across India. And we saw how the patterns have changed over the last decade compared to the previous 40 years. And we see in many sub-districts there's an increase in precipitation, and many, there's a decrease. But the problem is the timing. So, for instance, we sow our summer crop in June or July. That's when you need that irrigation water to come in. If there is a decrease then, but overall there is an increase, doesn't help. So the quantity of water, along with the timing of water, along with the quality of water, is what is needed. That's where your point about conservation comes in and preservation comes in. Because we have to think about water not just in terms of what you see. When I say the word water, what comes to your mind? Something blue, right? We're right by the lovely sea. But there's something called green water. Green water is water that is in our soil, in our plants, in atmospheric rivers. And that often is a lot more than the blue water we see. So your point about conservation and preservation is that we've got to make sure that we are holding on to the water that is coming down as rain, recharging our soil, recharging our groundwater, so that in future, it's like a bank deposit. In future, you can draw on it when you are in water stress. So you've got to even out the water flow in a way that you're able to manage your agriculture, industry, and your homes in a regular way, rather than a lot of water at one time and very little in another.
Great. Got a big picture about water right now. So what can you tell us about the India's energy transition in terms of, are they learning from the journey that from the other developing countries that they can take?
Well, I think there's lessons to be shared in all directions. As I was saying earlier, India's energy transition has been quite remarkable because it's not singular, it is plural. Over the last decade, India has gone from being a country that had the maximum number of people without electricity to being a country where 99% of homes now have a connection to an electricity wire. That, across the developing world, is the first energy transition, from not having energy to having energy. In just an 18-month period between 2017 and 19, India electrified 11,000 human beings every hour. And 130 million people got electricity like that. The world as a whole still has about 700 million people with no electricity at all, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa. To get them electricity by 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be achieved, every hour from now until then, 11,500 human beings have to get electricity. So how did India roll out electricity access so quickly? That's a lesson others have to learn. Similarly, how did India go from very little renewable energy to the fourth largest renewables market within a decade and a half? These are lessons India can share. But equally, Kenya has experimented with how do you make payments for electricity through mobile platforms. Sri Lanka here has large amounts of hydropower. Vietnam has invested a lot in wind power. In Namibia, they have injected a lot more clean electricity than even the United States in terms of share of electricity. So I think what we need is platforms where the Global South countries can share those experiences. Share those experiences on policy design, on market design, on business models, on financial models, on creating jobs, on skilling. India has a program called Surya Mitras, Friends of the Sun, developing new curriculums so that you train people for how to become solar engineers. Now, similarly with digital platforms, yours is one, could solar engineers or potential solar engineers in island countries learn from each other about how they are deploying those systems? So I think what is happening with technology is that the energy access and the energy transition towards cleaner energy sources can be accelerated and can be more distributed and can be more democratized. And that is really the story that Global South countries, including my own, need to share with each other.
Great. So as Dr. mentioned, that our platforms like the Hari Global Network is always there to make the public aware about all these unsaid stories that y'all might not know about, these little datas which are existing within the world but still not exposed within the social media platforms. So with that, Doctor, would like to ask our final question. There are so many young people who do care about the world, but they don't know where to start from. What is the best piece of advice that you'd like to give for them?
Dream big. That's the best piece of advice I can give.
How can
I
those dreams-
I don't maybe look young, but I was very much young when I started the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And as I said, our median age, even with a team of 380 odd people, is still under 30. So we are a team of dreamers who are trying to implement our dreams. In fact, we have collaborated with the UN Foundation to create something called the Next Generation India Fellowship, where young Indians from many walks of life, from energy, from health, from space technologies, etc., have come together to imagine what the India of 2047 would look like. They've come up with a dictionary of the future. What words will be used? So I think the biggest failure we often have is a failure of imagination. But the biggest asset young people have is, the lack of any inhibition to be embarrassed. There's no harm in trying something and failing. There's harm in not trying at all. And I think the energy of the youth, when channeled through institutional platforms, such as the one we've created at CEW, but many others, channeled through fellowships and partnerships. We've created a Global South Fellowship program. We'd love to see Sri Lankans come and spend some time with us. These are ways in which we can bring our energies together and solve problems, as I said. There's no point just describing problems or complaining about them. The only way to predict the future is to shape it.
Great. So with that, thanks a lot for Dr. Arunabha Ghosh for joining with Hari TV. And it's a greatest pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Disha. Okay. Pleasure to be here.